Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa. I present these videos weekly for two reasons. One, to just help bring my brain out of preparation mode and throughout the course of the week into preparation mode as I actually write and prepare the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. The second reason for creating these videos is just to allow you, the viewer, who have stumbled across it for whatever reason, if you were looking for it or if you just happened to find it, to gain some different insight into the weekly gospel text as lined out by the lectionary. This particular weekend, or Sunday, I should say, which is October 4th, 2015, the 19th Sunday after Pentecost, our gospel lesson comes out of Mark chapter 10, verses 2 through 16. Now, just a little bit of background. If you happen to have caught the last few videos, we've been in this section of kind of in the middle of Mark for several weeks now, and we've had a lot of gospel lessons that have seemed very disjointed, almost like there's different sections within each one that kind of almost have nothing to do with one another, and it seems like this is a big jumbled batch of various teachings that Jesus did during the course of his ministry, and we kind of scratch our heads and think, well, why are those together? Today is no different. It's kind of a continuation as Jesus has been moving around the area. Previously, towards the end of chapter 9, Jesus was in Galilee, which is in the northern part of this region where he was active. And today we hear that he's heading south towards Judea, Jerusalem, and the portion on the far side of the Jordan River. So he's definitely southeast of where he had been before. So that's kind of what's going on yet again as he's wherever he is, as he's moving towards Jerusalem, which he actually arrives in Jerusalem in chapter 11. So just one chapter after this, we lead into Mark's account of Holy Week and Easter, which we will not hit within our gospel lessons anytime soon. That was back in the spring, and we're about as far away from that as we can in the overarching calendar right now. But that's kind of where we're at in terms of Mark's gospel by itself. So that's where Jesus is at. And as per normal, wherever he goes, he encounters a crowd. People come to him and he teaches them. And sometimes there's opposition, and sometimes there's questions that come from his disciples who are also with him. That all happens today, and then we have a completely unrelated situation, or what at least at face value seems to be. So with that said, let's dive in. Some Pharisees came, and to test him, they asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." Okay. We don't know the motivation for why the disciples posed this, or not the disciples, excuse me, the Pharisees posed this question to Jesus. Perhaps he has been teaching about divorce prior and they caught wind of it and they thought, hey, this could be a good way to discredit him, much like politics today. Make the people afraid of your opponent, and that's the best way you can make him look bad so that people won't like him. That's what they try and do. So they ask, is it lawful? Because for them, in their law, it is. And it goes back to Moses, as we hear, and back in Deuteronomy, clear back in the Old Testament, there was a law stating that a man could divorce his wife, give her a certificate of divorce, and release her from their marriage. Now, this was actually intended as a way to protect the woman. In this patriarchal society at the time, women had no rights whatsoever, and they weren't a whole lot better off in Jesus' time. A little bit, but not a whole lot better. And yet this was intended as a way to protect them, so that if the husband was displeased with the wife for whatever reason, and I'm not saying it's okay, but if he was, he could write the certificate of divorce, releasing her to go back into her father's house or to her family's house, so that she could then marry again, and have it still be lawful. So that was the intention of this law. And the Pharisees are trying to use it now to see, well, can we trip up Jesus this way? So Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, Moses, wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man should leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Okay. That's the end of the first portion. We're going to see coming up in the couple of verses to follow that he then is alone with the disciples, and they talk a little bit more about it. But we see that Jesus says it's because of your hardness of heart that you have this commandment, that you have this law. The flawed reality of humanity. God recognizes it. That's why God gave the laws to Moses as God did. This is not to say that it's perfect, but it allows for the continuation, and as I mentioned before, the protection of the women, because God is about life. God is about protecting. God is about looking out for people, and yet God is also about relationship. And what we see here, what Jesus is really getting at, is that divorce is the breaking of a relationship, the death of a relationship. And that's no different today. Now, the tricky part about this teaching, and what I bumped into before when I preached on the same similar text out of Matthew's gospel, is how do you deal with this? Because divorce is a very real reality within our society today, and in fact, it's more than 50% of marriages now. And so, what does the Bible say? Well, Jesus seems to state that divorce is bad and that God is against it. Now, is that saying that God is telling us that it's morally wrong? I don't know. I don't know the mind of God in this. I wish I did. It would be really helpful from a preaching standpoint. Unfortunately, I don't. But what I do feel is that God is about relationship. That's why Jesus came to earth in the first place, to heal the breach in the relationship between God and humanity, as well as to help heal the breaches between people, to make forgiveness possible. Because sin breaks relationship. That's what it does. It breaks our relationship with God. It breaks our relationships with one another. And that's what we see divorce does. It breaks a relationship. Now, again, I'm not saying that divorce is not the best option for some couples out there. But that doesn't make it good. Divorce may be right, but that doesn't make it good. And I think that's what Jesus would say. I hope, but I don't know. Again, I don't know. I don't know the mind of God. It would be really helpful if I did. But that being said, let's move on, because we see in the next couple of verses just a little bit more of that connection of the sinful nature of broken relationship. Then in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Okay, so adultery, of course, one of the 10 commandments. And the 10 commandments are aimed at two things: the relationship between God and humanity, and then the relationship between individuals. And this breaks one of those commandments. That's what adultery is. It's a broken relationship between spouses, or between the spouses of another. I mean, however you want to define it, and that can be a little tricky at times, but that's what it is. And we see Jesus seems to be indicating the dire nature of divorce, that it is the death of a relationship. And God intended relationships to be ongoing, lifelong. And I'm not just talking about marriage here, but that we are intended to be in relationship throughout the course of our lifetimes. And that God mourns broken relationship, and that any broken relationship is in its inherently a bad thing. Even if it's the right thing, it's not a good thing. And I feel that I can't stress that enough. But okay, so that's the end of the divorce portion of this. And then we move into the very disjointed extra portion that's wonderful, and I kind of wish it was alone, because I would just preach on that. But people were bringing little children to him, Jesus, in order that he might touch them. And the disciples spoke sternly to them. But when Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, let the little children come to me. Do not stop them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. Truly I tell you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. And he took them up in his arms, laid his hands on them, and blessed them. Okay, so now we have this section where again Jesus is focusing on the weak, those without rights, the lowest of the low children. They were pretty much the bottom of the totem pole in terms of status in that time. And yet, as we've seen, and we saw back in chapter 9, a lot of similarities. There, Jesus said, you want to be great, receive the least of these, receive the children. And now he says, when just a chapter later, as the disciples are like rejecting them, like, hey, don't bring kids. He's too busy. Don't bring kids. He gets really ticked off at him. It says, in fact, it says he's indignant, and we hear that very, very rarely in the New Testament, particularly Jesus. But it's interesting when we think about what gets Jesus fired up. Another one happens just one chapter later when he enters the temple and finds it a marketplace, and he gets really pissed off about that. And he's throwing tables around and driving out all the livestock and everything. The den of robbers that we hear about. The cleansing of the temple is what I guess I'm trying to say. That's a time when Jesus gets indignant. He goes postal. He just goes off. And he seems to have the same situation here. Like, disciples, I've just told you that if you want to be great, receive, accept these little ones. And then they block it. And so Jesus gets mad. But then he starts talking about the notion of accepting the kingdom. And there's a little bit of ambiguity in there. And it says, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it. And we tend to think of that from the direction of we have to accept the kingdom as if we were the child, the faithful, unquestioning, unhating, lowest of the low. Is it the other way around? Is it saying that we need to accept the kingdom as we would accept the child, in a loving way, in a fully accepting way? I don't know. That's, again, there's ambiguity there. Either way is important to remember that we need to receive the kingdom and that it belongs to the children as well. And perhaps it's saying that, hey, you better pay attention to the kiddos because they've actually got it figured out. Hard to say. Again, it's complicated. Where I think I'm going with the sermon in this particular thing, and again, these two things seemingly disconnected as all get out, but what I'm thinking about is just the notion that the rules are never going to suffice for us. We see the Pharisees bring the notion of law to Jesus. Like, the law says this, what do you say? And then we also kind of see that, like, hey, the disciples are saying, well, sorry guys, he's too busy. It's kind of against the rules for you to be here. It's not proper for you to be here. And Jesus really seems to come to break down the barriers, to break down the rules, because the rules will never suffice for us. The law will never suffice for us. It was intended clear back in Moses' time as a gift to the people of this is how to live. This is how you live in harmony with God and how you live in harmony with one another. But the presence of sin, the broken relationships that I already talked about, we can't do it. It's impossible. So the law will never suffice for us. The rules will never suffice for us. But we're really good at trying to ask the question of what do I need to do? What's the minimum level? What's the acceptable? Like, how much do I have to pull off? And we continue to see that through the rest of chapter 10 as well. There's some other things that are coming up where individuals basically ask Jesus, hey, what do I have to do to inherit the kingdom? And Jesus is like, well, you know the commandments, do them. And he says, well, I have. And he's like, well, it's still not enough. The rules are never going to do it for us. And we have to rely on the grace of God given to us through the presence of Jesus Christ, through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, where the relationship is made possible again, is restored despite the presence of sin in our reality. That's kind of what's happening with our gospel lesson this week. I hope this has been helpful. It's a hard passage, and it is, and it's disjointed, and yet we try and find the gospel within it, and the gospel that the rules are not good enough, or the rules will not get us there, but God accepts us despite that. That's kind of the gospel in a nutshell. I hope this has been helpful for you. I hope you have a blessed week. If you have any thoughts or of your own questions, comments, you want to continue the conversation, pop those down in the comment section, and we'll continue it that way. Otherwise, have a great week, and God bless.